most fundamental God-given rights have always been under attack. But today, these attacks seem to be more virulent and more persistent than ever before. And so maybe today is a really good opportunity to get more familiar with that great bulwark of our fundamental rights, the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Hi, I'm Pete Fenzel, and I'm your host for In Their Own Words, the story of the American experiment and the words of the people who made it happen. And today's episode is the story of the First Amendment. Now, many of you have heard about it, many of you have discussed it, and even argued about it perhaps. But how many of you actually read the First Amendment and are familiar with it? Well, let's put that up on the screen and let's read it together. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. To understand fully the significance of these words of the First Amendment, you need to know why they're there. Back in the early days of our country, and even before when we were colonies, there were established religions in the colonies. The Church of England was the established religion of the United Kingdom, and we were a British colony. Public money was spent to support that church and their ministries. And if you did not attend divine services and instruction, many times you could be accused of a crime. And that's why the Pilgrims left England and eventually made their way to Plymouth Rock so they could practice their own beliefs, their own religious convictions without hindrance. In the colonies, many southern colonies in particular, adopted the Church of England as their established church supported by public funds, and after independence, the Episcopal Church. Up in the north, in New England, the Congregationalist Church was the established church in many states, supported by public funds, ministers paid out of the public treasuries. And once we had independence, 11 of the 13 states wrote constitutions. Now, those constitutions oftentimes guaranteed your right to your religious freedom of expression, but still there were restrictions. For example, in the Constitution of New Jersey, Catholics and Jews could not vote or hold office. Those roles were limited only to Protestant men, despite the fact that the Jewish communities during the Revolution were incredibly patriotic, and that Irish and German Catholics, by the thousands and thousands, served, suffered, and died for the cause of independence. Well, things changed, and the medium that changed was Thomas Jefferson in 1777, who wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which took the government out of the religion business and treated all religions equally without any preference, guaranteeing all of our rights of conviction and conscience and worship and faith, but taking the government out of the equation. Well, Jefferson's proposed statute was not acted upon for many years until Patrick Henry, remember him, he was the fellow who said it in the Virginia Convention in March of 1775, "Give me liberty or give me death." Well, he proposed a statute that would require Christian denominations of every sort to be official established religions of the state of Virginia. And that immediately stimulated the opposition by James Madison and Tom Jefferson, who successfully opposed Patrick Henry's efforts. And indeed, Madison ushered Jefferson's statute through the Virginia legislatures so that it was adopted in 1786. And it was not lost on the men in Philadelphia who only less than a year later gathered for the Constitutional Convention. The men in Philadelphia who were drafting the Constitution understood fully the significance of Jefferson's statute. And there is no reference whatsoever in the proposed Constitution that came out of the convention to any establishment of a religion or any encumbrance upon a person because of his religious beliefs. But there was one thing that was missing from the Constitution that had to be resolved. Many state constitutions had a first part which would be a statement of rights or a Bill of Rights describing the fundamental rights of the people that the government was forbidden to in any way impair. The people were used to having those types of statements, and they would not adopt the Constitution without one. And so on the promise that the first Congress under the Constitution would draft amendments to the Constitution to include that statement of a Bill of Rights, the people agreed in the different states to adopt the Constitution. And so James Madison was the primary author of the proposed Bill of Rights, and then as a member of Congress and in the House of Representatives, they wrote 17 distinct articles, each one of which was intended to be a distinct amendment to the Constitution. Then those proposed amendments were given to the Senate, who massaged them, reworked them, and narrowed them down to 12 articles. And those 12 articles became the proposed amendments to the Constitution, which were submitted to the states. Now, the Constitution itself provides for a means of changing it when necessary. Article 5 shows that we can amend the Constitution in two ways, either by convention or through Congress. And if 2/3 of both houses agree upon the wording of an amendment to the Constitution, then if 3/4 of the states of the Union agree to ratify that amendment, then it becomes a part of the Constitution. Of the 12 proposed amendments, the first two were not that significant. The first one had to do with the number of people in congressional districts. And the second one had to do with whether or not congressmen could vote raises for themselves. And the people probably didn't think that they were significant enough in order to amend the Constitution itself. So that left Articles 3 through 12, those 10 articles. And the people thought that those 10 articles were worthy of their approval, and so Articles 3 through 12 were adopted. Number 3 became the first article to amend the Constitution, and we called that the First Amendment. Go figure. Who would have thunk that? So that is how the First Amendment came to be. The First Amendment is unadorned. It has no modifications. It has no equivocation. It is a very firm, distinct thou shalt not to the federal government, saying you will not establish a religion, you will not prohibit our free exercise of our faith, you will not violate our right to free speech or a free press or the right to assemble or the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. Okay. There's no explanation needed. There's no justification stated. It is plain, simple, straight to the point, thou shalt not. And so we don't have established religions in this country. But that doesn't mean that we banish the Lord from the public square. But in 1948, a situation arose where the state of New Jersey decided to help parents pay for the public transportation costs of their kids to get to and from school. And it was for all school kids in New Jersey. You figure that if you have a bunch of kids going on the bus every morning and every afternoon to and from school 5 days a week, that's going to wind up being a significant amount of money for some parents. And the state decided they were going to help the parents out by defraying some of the cost of that by reimbursing some money to the parents. Well, some people decided to sue the state, saying that, wait a second, you're including Catholic school kids and reimbursing the parents for those expenses. And that was alleged to have been a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Well, it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, it's not. There's no money going to the church. The money is going to the parents to help them with the cost of educating their kids. But the Supreme Court did something funny in that decision. Everson against Board of Education. They made a reference to a private letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association when he was president in 1801. It was a private letter. It was not a public document. It wasn't part of the Constitution. It wasn't part of any law or statute. It was just a letter. And Jefferson said this in his letter to the Danbury Baptist Association. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Now, the metaphor that Jefferson used is really a wall to protect religion from intrusions by government, not the other way around. It's not to protect government from any reference or influence of religion. But courts and much of our culture has seized upon that one private letter, that one little phrase in that private letter, that one metaphor, to banish any reference to the Lord in our public square, from our schools, from our institutions. And our society has become increasingly, indeed thoroughly secular at this point in time. And I think you can see the difference in our society since then, that we are far more profane and far more vulgar than ever we were before in our history. Even today, it is clear that your religious convictions are under attack. People cannot oftentimes stand quietly and silently on a public sidewalk and pray if they happen to be near an institution where they disagree with. During the pandemic, you might remember that churches were closed and that people were given tickets and sometimes accused of crimes for trying to hold an outdoor service inside of their own cars with the windows up with absolutely no capability whatsoever of infecting each other, all within the guidelines that the government had issued, and yet they were criminalized for doing that, and the churches were forcibly closed. In the meantime, all the liquor stores and the casinos were wide open. Somebody please explain to me how that is not an infringement of our religious freedoms. On to the freedom of speech. The First Amendment doesn't define it because everybody knows what freedom of speech is. Everybody back then lost their freedom of speech, and they had to fight 8 years of a bloody, horrible, destructive war against Great Britain to redeem their rights of free speech and for free press. Unlike the past, where we had hundreds, if not thousands, of newspapers around the country, all expressing specific beliefs, all differing in their opinions, today it seems that almost all information that is given to the American people is filtered through a handful of IT and corporate media conglomerates who can squash information and censor information at will whenever something is at odds with their belief systems. But the answer to misinformation, the answer to hate speech, the answer to even the most vile behavior of people is not censorship. It's not canceling people. We had the answer right in front of us for the past 240 years, and it's in the preamble to the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, where Jefferson's beautiful words are only second in beauty and significance to his second sentence of the Declaration of Independence. And he says this: "Truth is great and will prevail if left to herself. She is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error, and has nothing to fear from the conflict unless by human interposition disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate, error ceasing to be dangerous when it is permitted freely to contradict them." So the antidote to hate speech, the antidote to misinformation, is not censorship and less speech. It is not controlling what we're allowed to see and hear. The antidote is more freedom, more speech, to get the truth into the ears and eyes of more and more people, so that the lies and the hatred will wither and die under the bright sunshine of the truth. That's how a free people protect themselves from propaganda, hate speech, and misinformation. And we're falling down on the job today. Well, that brings us to the final point. What is our role in all of this? Are we going to rely upon a sheet of paper to protect all of our rights? Well, a number of years ago, Supreme Court Justice, the late Antonin Scalia, delivered a lecture on the First Amendment, and he addressed this very specific problem. He referred to the Constitution of the Soviet Union, the most vile and vicious totalitarian communist dictatorship and police state, guilty of the murder of millions upon millions of people and the enslavement of millions more. And in the Constitution, you would think that you were reading Madison and Jefferson, and that the Soviets were plagiarizing our highest principles. But it was nothing but cynical window dressing, a piece of paper that was easily ignored by the Soviet government, which continued unhindered of their depredations against human liberty. So, for you folks and me, we can't just trust that a sheet of paper is going to protect our freedoms. We have to etch the principles of the First Amendment in our hearts and our souls, and we have to act. Whenever we see government intrusion upon our rights, we have to speak up, we have to vote, and we have to talk to our neighbors and friends. Because we have a duty to pass on to our children and their children the blessings of liberty to our posterity, and to give to them an America freer and even better than that which was given to us. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. God bless you.